Welcome to Inside the Middle East, a Q&A series at the Middle East Initiative. My name is Colin Eide, and I'm a second-year Master in Public Policy student here at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. I'm also Editor-in-Chief of the Harvard Journal of Middle Eastern Politics and Policy. Today I have the great pleasure of being joined by Dr. Hanan Ashrawi, a renowned legislator, human rights activist, and scholar. Dr. Ashrawi was the first woman to be elected to the Executive Committee of the Palestine Liberation Organization and has been representing Palestine as an official spokesperson in peace talks with Israel since the 1980s. Dr. Ashrawi is the recipient of numerous honorary degrees and distinguished awards. Dr. Ashrawi, ahla wa sahla, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Colin. It's my pleasure.
My first question has to do with the most recent round of talks being brokered or shepherded by U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. You said at last night's forum event that the negotiations have become the objective in themselves and not a means to a final solution.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could expound a bit on this and also talk about if this is going to be the case in the future, why continue to negotiate?
Absolutely. If negotiations become an exercise in futility and a sort of repetitive pattern that is generating a negative dynamic, then certainly they become counterproductive and they negate their very objective, which is what has happened so far, in the sense that the emphasis has been on the process rather than on the substance, rather than on the objective. And therefore, it incorporated, on the one hand, the asymmetry of power. It allowed the powerful side, the occupier, to exploit its power against the occupier, against the occupied. And it robbed the weaker party of any access to global or international instruments of self-empowerment, including international law. It also did not curb any violations by the Israelis on the ground, including settlements, including transformation of Jerusalem, annexation of territory, and so on, which meant that while ostensibly you're talking about a two-state solution, you're allowing the more powerful side to destroy the two-state solution by destroying the possibility of having a viable Palestinian state and by creating larger Israel. In my experience, we kept saying if the means are flawed, you fix them. If you have an instrument like or a tool like the negotiations, and this instrument is flawed, you either fix it or you replace it with something else. Unfortunately, there has been a persistence in doing the same thing over and over and over again, adopting Israeli priorities, allowing the process to run its course in a way that provided Israel with more immunity to act with impunity and privilege, and destroying the Palestinian chances of having freedom, dignity, and sovereignty. So we were hoping that this new initiative by John Kerry would sort of draw the proper conclusions from the process that began in 1991 till now, and try to maintain some sort of integrity and viability by addressing the real issues rather than the process itself, by curbing Israeli violations, by basing it on agreed terms of reference and international law, and therefore safeguarding its own viability and integrity.
If this continues to be the case, some, including Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas's own son, Tariq, have called for something along the lines of moving towards the one-state solution instead of the two-state solution. In light of a 2013 poll by Zogby that found that less than half of Palestinians believe that the two-state solution is doable, and only 34% of Israelis believe the same thing. Would it not be a better negotiating tactic or national strategy to simply fold the institutions of the Palestinian Authority and demand full and equal citizenship in Israel?
Yeah, well, there is a lot of talk. There are lots of creative ideas coming out now, the one state or one land, one homeland, two states, or the overlapping sovereignty issue, or all sorts of issues, the binational state, the one secular democratic state, which we discussed in 1969. I'm sure you don't remember, Colin. So in a sense, it seems to me the one-state solution is becoming a de facto reality rather than a political program. because there's no consensus on the one-state solution anywhere, whether in Palestine or in Israel or in Europe or anywhere in the world, because in a sense Zionism has placed the imperative of division and separation on the table. International resolutions have made it possible. We made the historical compromise of accepting Israel on 78% of historical Palestine. And unfortunately, even that is being destroyed. So, de facto, the one-state solution is taking the shape of Greater Israel, attempting to prevent a Palestinian statehood and sovereignty, to free Israel's hand to create prejudicial unilateral moves on the ground, annexation of land and resources and so on, and expansion of settlements. And in a sense, we're being told that you have to embrace a one-state solution by some people, knowing that it will mean the perpetuation of the occupation. It will free Israel's hand to do more damage. We have seen how Israel managed to create a system of legal, effective, on-the-ground, administrative, functional discrimination against the indigenous Palestinians who stayed in historical Palestine and Israel. And they are citizens of Israel, and yet they are being treated with such blatant discrimination and racism. And here you have Palestinians who are now being transformed into the demographic threat to Israel, because we happen to be non-Jews. And I know that Israel is perfectly capable of maintaining a system of apartheid and discrimination and total exclusion of the Palestinians from any consideration of the law or human rights, and pressing ahead with Greater Israel. So only if the one-state solution becomes a matter of international consensus, because right now we've gone to the UN and we've had our recognition as a state, and therefore we are working to try to get our boundaries, our borders, our capital, and so on, our right to self-determination recognized. It's going to mean, a sort of 180-degree shift and saying, okay, we will stop seeking freedom and sovereignty and so on, and we will start seeking only equal rights within an apartheid system of Israel. That means that we have postponed any type of solution for generations, probably. And it means that, again, Israel would feel perfectly free to pursue its own expansion, because I don't think that there is the political will on the part of the US or the international community at large to intervene, to curb Israeli violations, and to hold it accountable.
I also wanted to ask you about the state of Palestinian intellectual life. You were close with the late Edward Said, who was a champion for the Palestinian cause and a renowned academic. Today there's no shortage of activists, intellectuals, well known in the West and in Palestine. I'm thinking of Rashid Khalidi, I'm thinking of Joseph Masad. But no one seems to quite rise to the level of Edward Said. Nobody seems to have taken up his mantle. I was wondering your thoughts both on the state of Palestinian intellectual life today. Is there someone who could inherit what Edward Said left behind? And is there a debate going on in Palestine that we're not hearing in the West, either because we're not listening or because we don't speak Arabic?
Yeah. No, certainly there is always a debate, but let's start with the Edward Said legacy. You see, every country, every culture, every state sort of has its own larger-than-life figures, some of them in the political arena, some of them in the intellectual arena, and Edward Said certainly made his name outside Palestine. He made his name as a global player, and then he brought to bear this type of presence, this type of impact in the literary world and the history of ideas, and through his writings, through his real expression of quality, so to speak. And he brought that into the struggle for Palestine. So it wasn't that he came to prominence through his struggle for Palestine and then gained international intellectual recognition. He managed to engage the world according to its own terms, and in terms of intellectual pursuits, and in terms of his political statement, his national commitment, he engaged the world on his own terms. It was an amazing combination. And I don't think that such phenomena can be repeated frequently. I think we may have lots of distinguished people. I think, Edward Said Mahmoud Darwish to me is an amazing creative poet as well. He embodied the Palestinian experience and national identity. He wrote in Arabic, but at the same time he became recognized internationally. So his progress is the opposite of Edward's progress. He started with the struggle, he encapsulated it, he expressed it creatively, and then it was translated and the world took notice. We do have others. Of course, you mentioned Rashid Khalidi, you mentioned Masad, you mentioned others. There are quite a few, the Maqdisi brothers, who are also the nephews of Edward. And in Palestine, you do have an ongoing and lively debate within civil society. It hasn't crystallized enough, and we haven't had an output of such quality as to make inroads into the consciousness of, sort of global intellectual arena. But I think you will see there are some wonderful poets at home, but they're writing in Arabic. There are quite a few people who are sort of coming to grips in a very creative combination of intellectual rigor and political commitment, the sort of joint language that Edward legitimized. But they still haven't reached the stature or the status to be noticed globally. The Palestinians in exile are not constrained by living under occupation. They have greater freedom to sort of explore their possibilities internationally, and then to bring Palestine to bear on this freedom to engage intellectually outside.
Well, Dr. Ashrawi, it was an absolute pleasure having you with us today.
Thank you, Colin.
And thank you for your thoughtful responses, and we hope to see you back at Harvard sometime.
I would love to be back. I enjoyed my visit here, and I think I'll repeat it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.